Hi, my name is Oliver, and in today's video I'll teach you how to animate 3D particles natively in After Effects, so let's jump right into it. When working with 3D particles in general in After Effects, there's a lot of issues that you can run into. One example is that if you want the best of the best, which is the particular plugin, you will have to pay hundreds of dollars a month, and it's not really everyone that has that kind of a budget. Also, if you want to work with 3D assets, you often need to find 3D models, you may need to use Element 3D, and really quickly it can get quite expensive. So I found a way to use the native particle generators in After Effects and combine them with stock videos to really get a great effect quite cheaply. To find the elements needed, I'll be using Envato Elements, who happens to be the sponsor of this video. Envato Elements is a massive marketplace with more than 53 million creative assets, including videos, photos, sound effects, music, graphics, fonts, After Effects templates, and much more. All of this at a very affordable price, including unlimited downloads, and if you click the link in my description, you'll get 50% off the annual subscription. So when we are on the homepage of Envato Elements, you can see that's a lot of different categories that we can choose from. Now we are only going to work with stock videos for this one, so we'll just click that one. So I want to create sort of a theme for this video, and as coffee is generally something that a lot of people drink first thing in the morning, I think we should go that route. Therefore, I'll try and search for some coffee beans, and because we want them to be isolated so they're easier to put into the particle generator, we'll search for isolated at the end. As you can see here, we have a video of a few different coffee beans that are rotating in 3D space. So this is quite interesting, and I think this would be a great starting point for our animation, and this is something that we definitely can work with. Now you can use whatever you really want here. You just need some sort of video or element with a transparent background that we can plug into the generator. So I'll download this project and I can just add it to my coffee project, add and download. Within the downloaded folder, you can see that we have these 3 different stock videos. We can just select them and drag them into our project tab in After Effects. Now let's create our main composition. So we'll just click New Composition. And here we have a lot of settings that we can alter. So I'll just call this main. I'll go for a full HD composition, so 1920 by 1080. Let's set a frame rate of 24 frames per second. And let's make it around 10 seconds long. And now we have our composition. Let's select our first coffee bean, right click and press the new com from selection. This way it just creates a composition that fits perfectly with the footage. And if we scrub through, we can just see it's the coffee bean rotating in 3D space. And then here at the end, it perfectly loops. So now we have to decide whether this speed is appropriate, if we want it to go faster or if we want it to go slower. So in this case, we want the sort of particles to be falling from the top to the bottom. They'll be at a medium sort of speed. They will not follow gravity entirely, and therefore we maybe want to slow this down a bit. So we can right click, go to time, then we can enable time remapping. And here you can see that we get these 2 keyframes, and essentially that just tells us that this is the start and this is the end. So if we want this to take maybe around 9 seconds, we can drag the keyframe to 9 seconds. Then we can go to composition, composition settings, and we can set the duration to 9 seconds as well. This way we'll just maintain the loop, as you can see here towards the end. Now we can go into the main composition, take our coffee bean A and drag it in, and then we can repeat the exact same process for the coffee bean B and the coffee bean C. Then, when we have all 3 coffee beans in the main composition, you can see there's a bit of an issue as one of the compositions is not long enough. We can easily fix this by right-clicking, going to time, enable time remapping. Then we can Alt or Option click the stopwatch and type in the expression loop out. So what this does is it just loops it out, so we can drag this along, and as you can see, the particle keeps moving and just repeats itself. At this point, we can actually go ahead and hide all of the coffee beans. We'll go to Layer, New, Solid. We'll just call this the particles. And we can just make it a color that's pretty obvious, so maybe a yellow. Click OK. Then we'll go to Effects and Presets, and we'll use a native plugin to After Effects, which is called CC Particle World. So this can actually be quite effective if you know how to use it. And from the get-go, it looks a little bit wonky. You can see we have a grid, we have the -C up here in the left corner, we have a bunch of particles exploding all over the place, and yeah, really it's just a bit messy. But let's quickly clean this up. We can go to the grids and guides. Here we can turn off the radius, the motion path, the grid, horizon, and the axis box. And now we're just left with the particles and a controller here, which controls the positioning. So let's take these coffee beans and make them into particles. If we close this down, we can go into the particle tab, which is where you make all of the different changes to the particle. Right now it's set to line, which just means that it's a bunch of small lines, as you can see here, but we want it to reference one of these three compositions. Now to do this, we'll simply go into the particle type, choose the textured disk all the way towards the bottom, and now all of the particles disappear. So we can go into the texture tab, and here we can select the texture layer. So we can just start out with the coffee bean A, and as soon as you select that, you can see that something resembling coffee beans start to appear. But really it's all sort of opaque, they're quite small, and right now it doesn't really look like coffee beans, but we'll quickly fix that. We can start out by changing the birth size. So this is how large they are as they are being created. And really for sort of solid objects that go from one end of the screen to the other, we just want them to maintain their size or scale throughout the entire thing. So we can just copy that birth size and paste it into the death size. So you can see they all sort of have a bit of the same scale. Some are a bit smaller, some are a bit larger, and that's because of the size variation. So if you increase this, you can just see that they vary a lot in scale. Now we don't want them to vary this much, but we can do maybe around 30%. And because we're working with particles and there's a lot of them, your processing power can go down quite a bit and the render times can go up. So we can just take this and set it to maybe third, and we can just work with this for now, and that way we'll just render quite a bit quicker. Now the next thing we have to take a look at is the max opacity. We don't want any of the particles to be opaque because they are solid objects. So we can just turn this all the way up to 100%. Then we have the birth to death color map. You see right now they are actually quite orange and red. But if we go in here and we just switch them to white, they should get their correct colors back. So you can just see that we get the white highlights. Some of you may notice that we actually have a few particles in the background which are still opaque. And you may wonder, why does that happen when we have set the max opacity to 100%? Well, there's actually something called an opacity map. And if you open that up, you can see that right as they are being generated, they are actually at 0% opacity. Then they go all the way up to 100%, stay there mostly for their lifetime, and then they go all the way down to 0% again. So you can see that we can actually draw sort of a curve or a shape here, which will alter the opacity over the lifetime of a particle. Now we just want these to be at 100% opacity throughout the entire thing. So we'll just drag it all the way up here, and there shouldn't be any opaque particles left. So let's take a look at what we have gotten so far. You can see that we have a bunch of coffee beans exploding all over the place. Right now it's a bit hard to see that it's coffee beans because of their scale, the background color, the rotation. There's just a bit too much going on at the moment. So what we can do is go out of the particle tab and we can go into the physics tab. Here you can see that it's set to explosive, which just means that the particles sort of explode out from one singular point. One thing you can do here is open up the producer. Here you can see we have the radius for the X, Y, and Z. X is the horizontal axis, Y is the vertical, and Z is sort of the three-dimensional axis that goes into 3D space. So we can take the X-axis, drag it out, and that way, if we play it back, you can see that they sort of fall all over the place. On top of that, we can take this position point or X that we have, and we can just drag it on top of the composition here, and you can see that they fall down from the top. If we zoom in all the way, we can start to play around with the velocity the gravity, which sort of controls the speed. Because of the fact that they are just falling down, we can actually turn off the velocity and just work with the gravity alone. From the get-go, they are a bit quick. You don't really get to notice what's falling down. And we can just turn this down to maybe 0.2. Take a look, see if that's a proper speed. And quite quickly you notice a bit of an error. The thing is that the particles only live for 1 second. And because of the fact that we have decreased the gravity and the speed of the particles, they actually start disappearing before they have left the frame. So we can just increase the longevity, so we're sure that the particles actually get to fall all the way down before disappearing. And that's what's happening right here. There's also a lot of particles in the frame at once. And we also want to include the different particles and not just this type, so we want to decrease it quite a bit. The amount of particles is determined by the birth rate, which you can see right here. If we decrease it, fewer particles will be generated. So we don't want that many particles because we'll actually be layering this and we'll also be adding the other different particles. So maybe we can just go for 0.3, which should be fine. So to be able to see the coffee beans a bit better, we'll do a few color adjustments. We could start out by putting this to full, zooming in a bit, then we'll go to layer, new adjustment layer. We'll just call this CC as in color correction. And then we'll find an effect called curves. So when looking at this straight line, this up here is the highlights, midtones, shadows. So let's say we wanted even darker shadows, we could drag this to the right. If we wanted even lighter highlights, we could drag this to the left. Or otherwise, if we want the highlights to be darker, we can drag this down. But we want to sort of affect the midtones or the darker areas and make them a bit lighter. So we can drag this up a bit. And we can also counter it a tiny bit by turning down the highlights. So that way you can just see it's a bit easier to see that they are actually coffee beans. You can also add a brightness adjustment and put it onto the same layer and give them a bit more brightness. So now if we zoom out, it's a bit easier to see what we are working with. So you can see the highlight becomes a bit extreme. So we can just go in and maybe drag it down a tiny bit. And this is something you have to play around with for a bit until you get the result that you like. But now it's just quite a bit easier to see the actual coffee beans. Here's before and here's after. So when we have done this, we may want to take a look at the rotation. You can see that the individual coffee beans are rotating in 3D space because of our composition here. But there's also some rotation happening in just the standard x-axis. So we can click on the particles layer, close down the producer and the physics. And within the particle, there's actually a rotation speed. So if we turn this down, you can just see that they are rotating less. So we want a bit of rotation, not too much. And I think that's sort of a good starting point. So these will be the particles in the background. And that's also why I'm keeping them quite small. Now you have to imagine that the closer the coffee beans are to the camera, the faster they will move across the screen. So considering that they are in the background, we can actually turn the speed of the gravity down quite a bit. So maybe we can go for, let's say 0.07. And because of the fact that you are decreasing the speed, the particles will clutter more and they will be more visible. So we'll go into the birth rate. So maybe 0.03. So we just have a few of the particles falling down. We can increase it a tiny bit if we want to. But remember that we'll be layering this later on, so there'll be a lot more particles visible. I think this is fine for our first batch. And now we can move on to the second one. So we want all 3 particles visible for each layer. Now the background particles will be blurred a bit. The ones in the middle will be in focus. And then the ones that are very close to the camera, which are in the front, will also be blurred a bit. And this is just a way to sort of create some depth within your particles. And because of the fact that we're a bit limited by the CC Particle World plugin that's built into After Effects, we'll just find other ways around it. Because when using this particle plugin, as I understand it, you can't really create depth of field automatically. So you have to sort of fake it but it doesn't really take that much longer and you'll save a lot of money in the long run. So I'll show you how this is done. We'll start out by duplicating the particles layer twice by pressing Command and Control D 2 times. Then we'll call the first one particles A back. We'll call the second one particles B back. And we'll call the third one particles C back. That way we already have the A particles in the first one. Then we can go to the second one. We can go into the particle tab, and within the texture we can just change this to the coffee bean B. Now you can see that they are actually placed right on top of the other particles, and we don't want that. We want them to be sort of scattered all around. To do this, we'll go into the extras, and you can see that's a random seed. And as you increase or decrease this, you can just see that the particles are being generated at random. So we can just find one. Then if we play it back, you can see that we have two different types of particles, and they are also placed differently. This is really great because that way, if we zoom in, you can see there's one particle that's rotating in one way, this one, and then we have the other particles. So you get a bit of variety, and that's really what we want. We want variety in terms of how they are rotating, their scale, their positioning in C space, and all of that stuff. So that's what we're doing by layering this effect. You could stop here. You could say, I just want these simple particles. I want them for a quite simple project. But this is just taking it a step further. Now let's zoom out and we will go to the particle C. We'll go into the particle tab. We'll go into the texture and we'll choose the coffee bean C. Now let's go in and change the random seed again. And you can see that now we have all three types of particles. Now, as you can see, the particles sort of start slower at the top and increase in speed the more they fall. And that's because of gravity. If you let go of a ball from, let's say, a height of 20 meters, it will also accelerate in speed as it falls down. That's just how gravity works. Now, if you don't want this, you can go into the physics again. And instead of playing around with the gravity, you can set that to 0, and you can just play around with the velocity. So that way it will keep a constant speed throughout instead of accelerating. But I think for now this is fine and we'll just keep it. So now that we have the different types of particles, we perhaps want to differentiate the speed of them, maybe a bit in the scale. And the way we can do this is just by selecting one of the particle generators. Then we can go in and adjust the birth and death size. Let's set this to 1.4, 1.4. We'll also alter the physics tab. We will alter the gravity here. Maybe let's make this fall a bit quicker. And for the C particle, we can make that fall a bit slower perhaps. So maybe 0.055. And in terms of the scale within the particle, we can set that to maybe 1.1, something like that. We don't need to differentiate it a whole lot because they're on the same plane, but a tiny bit goes a long way. So you can see we have some different speeds and it really starts to become quite a bit random. Let's create layer number 2, which is the middle ground. We'll start out by taking the particles A back. We'll press Command and Control D to duplicate it, and we'll call this the particles A middle. To not get everything confused, we can hide these other layers for now, and we want to adjust a few things. So as I mentioned, the closer the particles are to the camera, the larger they will be, and also the faster they will fall. So let's start with the scale. We'll go into the particle tab and we'll increase the scale quite a bit. Copy that and paste it to the depth size. Maybe this is a bit too much. You can sort of play around with it. And really the particle generators within After Effects, the only way you get to really understand them is by playing around with them. So that's what I've done. I've just gone in. I thought, this is what I want to create. Let's try and see how I can do that. So you can try every single different adjustment and just tweak everything and sort of get a better understanding of it. But either way, we have the larger particles and now we want them to fall faster. So we'll go into the physics tab and we will find the gravity here and we can increase it to maybe 0.1. So let's see how that looks. As you can see, they fall faster. And if we want the sort of reference, we can turn on the other layers. And here we also want to maybe alter the random seed a bit. And now we can also take a look at the sort of contrast. Maybe they are not large enough. Maybe they don't stand out enough from the other particles. But this is something you have to decide on your own. Let's hide the other layers for now. We can also color code this layer by maybe making it pink, so we can differentiate them. You could also go into the layer, solid settings, and maybe change this to another color, just so it's easier to differentiate here. We could also make this green, so it's green all the way. And we could also make these ones yellow. Now, I think there's a bit too many particles considering that we'll be duplicating this twice. So in terms of the birth rate, that doesn't really go any lower than 0.025. For some reason, the particles start to disappear. So another thing I found that you can actually do is that you can go into the producer tab and you can just take the radius X and increase it a bit. So that way they are being generated over a wider distance. If you actually want to see the exact generator, you can go into the grid and guides. You can turn on the radius, and that way you can just see it's quite a bit wider. Let's take the particles and duplicate them twice. We'll just drag this to the top and we'll rename these. So we have the B middle and we have the C middle. So let's go inside the B, choose the particle texture to be the coffee bean B. Go a bit ahead in time and we will alter the random seed. We'll do the same for C, particle, texture, alter it, and also do that with the random seed. So now you can see we have the different particles and they are all being generated at random. So let's do a bit of adjusting in terms of the size. So this one we can maybe make a bit smaller. And then we can take the speed, then the physics, and maybe make it, let's say this one will go a bit faster than the other ones. For the B particle, we can make that larger perhaps, something like this. And maybe we can keep the speed of gravity and actually alter the A. So if we find the physics right here, we can make that go a bit slower. Play that back, you see we have the different speeds. Sometimes the generator is too close to the sort of edge here, which also means that in terms of the gravity, it's a bit too slow at the start. And that's also something to do with the scale of the particles. So we can take this generator if we want, drag it up a bit. We can also do this for the other ones. And again, this is something that just takes a bit of adjusting. So let's do it for the last one. And now we don't really want the order to be the same. We don't want it to be A, B, C, A, B, C. We can change this around a bit. So maybe make it, well, reversed or something completely different. Just meaning that if we turn these back on, you should be able to see the particles being generated. We have the smaller ones in the background moving slower, the larger ones moving a bit quicker. And right now I can already see that some of the particles are rotating a bit too much, especially the ones where you actually see the entire particle being laid out like this. I think it's coffee bean B, yeah. As you can see here, you actually have most of the particle visible at all times. Therefore, it's already rotating here, and if you apply the same X rotation in the main comp, it becomes a bit crazy. So we can select the particle B, then we can go into the particle and turn the rotation speed down quite a bit. Now we have them layered quite nicely, and we can go to the final layer, which is the front. For this one, we don't want that many particles because these are just the few particles that will get very close to the camera, sort of be quite a bit blurry, so we really get that depth perception. Therefore, we can just figure out which particle looks the best. So we have particle A, it's sort of rotating all over the place. We have particle B, that's maybe not that interesting because we're just seeing the front. And for particle C, that's maybe a bit too much rotation. So I actually think in this case, particle A is maybe the most interesting being the large particle. And if we want two different particles to be layered as the front particles, we will definitely go with A and C for now at least. So we'll take particle A, duplicate it by pressing Command or Control D, dragging it to the top, and let's go to Layers, Solid Settings, and we will just create, let's say, a red. And we'll also change the color out here to the red one. And for now, let's just hide all of the other layers. We want to increase the size, increase the speed, and sort of just adjust the entire thing. Let's go into the particle generator and we will find the scale or the birth size, and these will be quite large. So we'll copy and paste that. And you can see right now, way too many are being generated. So again, we'll use the same trick within the producer. Just increase the radius, and we just want one to be visible every now and then. Sort of like this. Should be fine. And also we want to increase the speed of them. So we'll go into the physics and maybe do 0.17. Let's see if that's a bit too fast, if that will work. We maybe want to alter the random seed just a tiny bit. And again, something you just play around with until you find a result that you like. And I think this is quite good. Maybe a bit more scale. That should actually be fine. We just have a particle falling down every now and then, which is quite a bit larger than the other ones. So let's maybe duplicate this one. And we'll try and see if we can also do this for the C particle. And we'll also call this the front. And we'll call the other one front so we don't get it confused. So let's go into the C. We'll hide the other one. Change the random seed. We'll go into the particle, texture, and change it to the C particle. So you can just see we have that particle falling down instead. And maybe let's alter the scale a bit. Let's go and make it a bit smaller. Copy and paste that. We'll also alter the speed. Maybe this one is falling, let's say, quicker. And we perhaps don't want to produce as many. So again, the X radius, we can try and play it back. You can see this just looks great. We have the subtle rotation in 3D space. We have some X rotation, we have it falling down, increasing in speed or velocity. And if we turn both of them on, let's just see if anything collides here. It looks quite good. But because of the scale, you can sort of see when they appear. You can see that they are very slow from the start. So what we want to do here again is to drag up the generator or the spawning point, whatever you want to call it. And that way we just have them going down a bit quicker from the get-go when they get visible. So let's see how this looks. And we don't have any of them colliding yet. So I think this is a good starting point. And we'll try and see how that works with all of the other layers. So your computer may start to get a bit slow by now. But that all really depends on how many particles, the resolution, your computer specs, and that sort of thing. So this is looking great already, but there's a few more things we can do to really sell the idea of this fake depth that we are creating. Because really, they're all on the exact same plane, and this is all something that we're just faking. But you know what they say, fake it till you make it, and that's what we're going to do. So we'll close down the particle world here, and we'll just start with the particles in front. So when it comes to blurs, there's a few different options. It really all depends on what look you're going for and the speed of your PC. So one you can go for is the camera lens blur. This tends to be a bit slower, but it also creates a beautiful blur, as you can see here, which you can customize quite a bit because it has a lot of different settings. Now another blur you can go for is the fast box blur. And as the name suggests, it's quite fast compared to the camera lens blur. And this also creates a nice effect, but as you can see, there is a bit of a difference. And again, It comes down to personal preference and how much control you really want over the blur. I'll go with the camera lens blur. Let's change the aspect ratio a bit maybe, make it a bit less blurry. And you can spend a lot of time tweaking these settings. I'll just go with a few basic ones. We can copy this and paste it to the other front particles. Here you can decide if you want the exact same blur strength, if you want it a bit stronger, but you can just see that very quickly you create some depth as the closer particles are blurred out. And then we can also go ahead and blur out some of the particles in the back. So let's copy this effect, paste it to the back particles, and you can just see because of their small scale, the particles themselves, this blur is way too much because you can't really even see what's going on. So we want to decrease this quite a bit and maybe go for something like 10%. We can paste that to the other ones. And here again, you can decide whether you want to differentiate them a bit. So maybe this one is not as blurred. And maybe this one is blurred a bit more. And now you can see that we are really focusing on the particles in the middle and the other ones are blurred out. And if you want to increase this effect even more, you can add a bit of blur to some of the particles in the middle. We can take the back middle particles. It gets a bit confusing with the names now, but we can paste the effect and maybe just add like 3%. But in general, here we have the effect with the overall depth. Now to make it look a bit cleaner, we have to composite everything and we need a new background. Now, because we have this adjustment layer on top, if we were to add a background in this composition, the background would also be affected by the adjustment layer. So what we can do is press Command or Control A to select all layers, right click, pre-compose, and we'll just call this the animation main. Then we can go to Layer, New, Solid. And let's just select a color from one of the coffee beans. So we want a bit of a dark background. That's at least what I'm going for. So something like this. I think that should be fine. Press OK and just drag it underneath the coffee beans. You can go with whatever color you prefer. I may even want this a bit darker actually. And again, this is all up to personal preference and what you're sort of using this project for. So you can see it sort of changes in real time. Somewhere around here should actually be good. Maybe I want to add a bit of a vignette, meaning that you can make it darker at the edges to sort of focus on the center, or you can just make it a bit lighter, really depending on where your focus is. So we can go to Layer, New, Solid. And something I like to do is actually picking a color that we can apply on top and multiply. So I'll go for an orange color, a sharp one, and we'll just call this the vignette. And while we're at it, we can also rename our background to BG. Then if we select the vignette, we can go up and select the ellipse tool. If that's not visible, you can click and hold and select it from the menu. If we double click it, you can see that it masks out an ellipse. We can just go ahead and subtract this. So we just have the edges. And then if we toggle the switches/modes, so we can see the mode, blending mode here, we can just click it and we can select the multiply. So you can see it adds a bit of color. It's a bit sharp right now. So we can go into the mask. We can feather it out quite a bit. We can also take the expansion. We can move it inwards so we have more color. We can move it outwards so we have less color. I want to move it in a bit. And maybe I want to just lower the opacity here, just so we have this subtle effect. And then I like to add a bit of grain to some of my projects. So we can go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, can name this grain. And in the effects panel, we can just search for the grain effect and we can add the grain. Now you can see it's just a preview here. It's previewing the grain in the center. We can switch it to the final output. And right now it's way too grainy. You can see that the effect is too intense. So we can just decrease that a bit. And right now it's actually animated. I don't really like that. So I can go into the animation and set the speed to 0. This way, if we zoom out, we just have a bit of grain, and you can always go in and lower it if you want to, or adjust it. And now you can see that we have it all composited, and we really get a lot of depth here. Now, if you want to maybe match up the background colors with the beans a bit more, you can also take this grain layer and add a curves effect. We can drag the curves onto our grain layer, grain adjustment layer. Maybe just increase the highlights or midtones a bit, just so it's a bit lighter. And really you can go in and adjust as much as you want and spend a lot of time here just getting the perfect video. One last thing that you can do to really sell the effect that these coffee beans are quite close to the camera is by going to the type tool. And here we can just type in, let's say, coffee. I just want this to be completely white. And I can just scale it up all the way like this. And let's see the paragraph. We just want the text to be centered. And then we can go up here and select the pan behind tool, which is the anchor point tool. Select the anchor point, press Command and Control to make it snap to the center. We can press Command and Control X to cut that layer, go into the animation main and paste it. And then we go into the Align tab and just align it perfectly in the center. And we just want to put it beneath the front particles. So here you can see that if we go into the main composition again, we just have the coffee beans falling on top of that text, really selling the effect that this text is placed in the middle of this composition and there's some actual depth. So we can go to the point where the coffee beans start to fall down, press B to trim the work area and start it at that point of time. And we have this animation playing. So this is one of those tutorials where you can take this concept and really apply it to anything you want. You could use simple 2D particles, which could be vector elements. You could use still images of 3D objects, and really there's endless possibilities. This video really just serves to show you some of the cool things that you could do with CC Particle World and introduce you to the different parameters that you can play around with, and you can take it into a million different directions. So I hope that you really learned something from this video. Now, if you want to find some stock footage for yourself, maybe even some graphic assets or images of 3D models to use in your projects, make sure to click the link in my description to get the discount for Envato elements. That's all for this video. I really hope that you learned something new. And if you did, I would greatly appreciate if you leave a like and post a comment down below. Tell me if you have any questions or any suggestions for future videos. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to get notified when I upload future videos. That's all for now. Till next time.